14 years ago, I made what I thought was a smart business decision. I walked away from a sinking ship called marriage to a woman who couldn't handle reality, and I left behind her autistic son who wasn't even mine biologically. Now that kid's digital art just sold for $950,000, and suddenly everyone thinks I'm the villain in this story. Let me tell you what really happened. The courthouse in Allen County smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. The morning air was thick with the kind of tension that makes smart men second-guess their strategies. I sat in my tailored navy suit, checking my Rolex while my attorney Wade Palmer shuffled through papers like he was dealing poker cards. The drive from Austin had taken me through half of Texas and all of Oklahoma, but some battles are worth the journey. Across the aisle, there was Colton Mills, the man who'd been playing house with my ex-wife and her damaged kid for over a decade. Blue collar written all over him, from his off-the-rack jacket to his calloused hands that probably hadn't seen a manicure in his life. The welder who thought he could step into my shoes and do a better job. We'd see about that. The judge called our case, and I felt that familiar rush you get when closing a big deal. This was just business after all. Preston Reynolds, technically still carrying my last name, had struck digital gold, and I wasn't about to let some stepfather wannabe steal what was rightfully mine. See, here's what nobody wants to talk about. I never signed up to be a father to a broken kid. When I married Brooke Reynolds back in 2009, she was a knockout brunette with ambition and a marketing degree. Fresh out of college, smart as a whip, with the kind of drive that made her perfect for the corporate wife role I needed. What she failed to mention during our whirlwind romance was that her 4-year-old son, Preston, came with enough behavioral problems to sink a Navy ship. I tried, I really did. I moved us into a nice suburban house in Fort Wayne, thinking maybe structure and stability would help. The place had good bones, 3 bedrooms, 2-car garage, decent neighborhood where property values were climbing. I figured if I was going to play stepfather, I'd do it right. Give the kid every advantage money could buy. But living with Preston was like having a live grenade in your living room. The kid couldn't handle normal sounds. Vacuum cleaners, blenders, even the doorbell would send him into meltdowns that lasted hours. He lined up his toy cars in perfect rows across the coffee table and had a complete breakdown if you moved one by accident. He spoke maybe 20 words total, and most of those were just echoing what he heard on his obsessive PBS shows. Brooke wanted me to be patient. "He's special, Bryce," she'd say, like that was supposed to make me feel better about coming home to chaos every night. "He just processes things differently." Different. That was the polite way of saying damage beyond repair. I was building my marketing company from the ground up during those months, putting in 12-hour days, networking events 3 nights a week, weekend strategy sessions that would eventually pay off in 7-figure contracts. Success doesn't happen by accident. It requires focus, dedication, and the ability to make hard choices. What I needed when I walked through my own front door was peace, a sanctuary where I could recharge and plan my next moves. Instead, I got a wife who spent all her energy managing a kid who would never be normal and, frankly, would never contribute anything meaningful to society. Every conversation became about Preston's needs, Preston's therapy, Preston's special diet requirements. Date nights became extinct because finding a babysitter who could handle his meltdowns was nearly impossible. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in October 2010. I just landed my biggest client yet, a 6-figure retainer deal with a tech startup that would eventually go public and make me rich. I came home expecting to celebrate, maybe open that bottle of Dom Perignon I'd been saving for a moment, exactly like this. Instead, I found Preston in the middle of another meltdown because Brooke had accidentally served his sandwich on the wrong plate. Not the wrong food, the wrong plate. The kid was on the kitchen floor, rocking back and forth and making those horrible keening sounds that went through my skull like a dentist's drill. Brooke was kneeling beside him in her work clothes, humming some tune like that was going to fix anything. She looked up at me with exhausted eyes ringed by dark circles and said, "He's having a hard day." A hard day. Like every day wasn't a hard day with that kid. Like my success meant nothing compared to a 4-year-old's inability to adapt to basic reality. "This isn't working," I told her. Simple as that. No point in sugarcoating the obvious. I can't live like this anymore. That's when she gave me the speech about commitment and family and how Preston needed stability. What Preston needed, I thought, was professional help in a facility designed for kids like him. Round-the-clock care from people trained to handle his specific problems. What I needed was a real life with a woman who could be a partner, not a full-time caretaker to someone else's broken child. I made my offer fair and square. I'd pay for Preston to get the best care money could buy at a residential facility, and Brooke and I could start fresh. Maybe have normal kids of our own someday. Kids who could hold conversations and play sports and maybe take over my business when they grew up. But Brooke looked at me like I'd suggested we sell her kidney on the black market. "He's my son," she said, voice trembling with misplaced maternal instinct. "He stays with me." Fine. That told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. Between building a future and enabling dysfunction, she'd chosen dysfunction every single time. I moved out that weekend. Clean break, no looking back, no dramatic scenes that would accomplish nothing except wasted energy. I left them the house, paid off, I might add, worth about $180,000 at the time. Generous considering I had no legal obligation to either of them. Brooke had never established paternity, and I'd never formally adopted Preston. From a legal standpoint, I was just a guy who'd been married to his mother for 18 months. I sent child support for a few months, because it felt like the decent thing to do. But my lawyer explained the reality. I had zero legal responsibility for a kid who wasn't mine biologically. Why throw good money after bad? The business world doesn't reward charity cases, and neither should personal relationships. By 2012, I'd relocated to Austin permanently, where the tech scene was exploding like a gold rush for anyone smart enough to position themselves correctly. I built my marketing firm into a multi-million-dollar operation, specializing in startup launches and IPO campaigns. The kind of work that requires strategic thinking, long-term vision, and the ability to cut losses when necessary. I married Ashley Brooks in 2014, Stanford MBA, no emotional baggage, shared my vision for success and wealth accumulation. She understood that building an empire requires sacrifices. We bought a lakefront house in Westlake Hills and filled our lives with the things that actually matter. Travel to places that expand your network, dinner parties with investors and industry leaders, building relationships that translate into opportunities. I didn't think about Preston for years. Why would I? Out of sight, out of mind, exactly as it should be when you make a clean break from a toxic situation. Brooke died in a car accident in 2016, and I sent flowers to the funeral because it was the decent thing to do. Professional courtesy, nothing more. Colton Mills, some welder from the working class side of Fort Wayne, had apparently stepped up to play daddy. Good for him. Someone had to, and better him than me. The first I heard about Preston's artistic success was a LinkedIn article that popped up in my feed last month. Fort Wayne Teen's digital art collection sells for record $950,000. The kid's face stared back at me from the photo, still had my sharp jawline, though he'd grown tall and lanky. The same intense eyes that used to unnerve people at family gatherings. The article gushed about his unique perspective and autism-inspired creativity, like his disability was some kind of superpower instead of the limitation it obviously was. Apparently, he'd been creating digital art pieces, something called NFTs, non-fungible tokens, that captured what the buyer described as raw emotional truth filtered through neurodivergent perception. $950,000. From computer drawings, some gaming. Studio had bought the entire collection for character designs in their upcoming fantasy franchise, plus ongoing royalty payments that could potentially reach hundreds of thousands more over the next decade. I'll admit, my first reaction was genuine surprise. The kid had always been obsessed with patterns and details, spending hours arranging things in precise configurations. Apparently, that obsessive attention to minutiae had translated into something commercially valuable. Who could have predicted that? My second reaction was more practical, that money belonged to the Reynolds family, and like it or not, Preston was still legally a Reynolds, carrying my surname and my genetic material. I called Wade Palmer immediately. Wade's the best family attorney in Texas, handled my divorce from my first wife, knows how to navigate complex financial situations with surgical precision. Within a week, we'd filed papers in Allen County establishing my parental rights and requesting guardianship oversight of Preston's newfound assets. "It's a reasonable request," Wade assured me over lunch at the Austin Country Club, where deals worth millions get made over handshake agreements. "You're the legal father. The stepfather has no standing. Kid's still a minor who needs adult supervision for that kind of money." The plan was straightforward: establish legal guardianship, set up proper financial management, take a reasonable percentage for administrative oversight. Standard procedure for protecting a minor's assets from poor decision-making. Happens all the time in entertainment industry contracts. But here's where things got interesting. When we showed up for the preliminary hearing, Preston wasn't the drooling, hand-flapping kid I remembered from those chaotic months in 2010. He sat perfectly still next to Mills, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and taking notes in a leather portfolio like some kind of junior executive. His movements were deliberate, controlled, efficient. The kid's lawyer, Trent Foster, some small-town attorney who probably handled traffic tickets and property disputes most days, looked nervous as hell shuffling through his papers. But Preston looked calm. Too calm for a teenager facing a legal challenge to nearly $1 million. Judge Patricia Winters called the case to order with the authority of someone who'd seen every sob story and legal maneuver imaginable. Wade launched into his opening argument like he was delivering a keynote speech at a business conference. Biological father returning to ensure proper financial stewardship. Stepfather with no legal authority. Minor child requiring professional guidance for complex estate management. Standard stuff. Should have been over in 30 minutes. Papers signed, financial arrangements formalized. Then Foster stood up and dropped the first bomb. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that Mr. Reynolds has already demonstrated his primary interest in these proceedings. We request permission to play audio recordings." "Audio recordings? What audio recordings?" I glanced at Wade, who looked equally blindsided. Neither of us had authorized any recordings. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, and I heard my own voice from last week's phone call with Wade. "Look, I don't care if the kid's Rain Man. $900,000 is $900,000. File whatever papers you need to file to get this moving." My throat went dry. How the hell had they recorded that? My office in Austin was supposed to be secure, and Wade's firm used encrypted communications for client confidentiality. Foster continued with the calm confidence of someone holding pocket aces. Mr. Preston Reynolds, acting through his legally appointed advocate, began audio documentation the moment Mr. Bryce Reynolds initiated contact with his legal team. Under Indiana's one-party consent laws, these recordings are fully admissible. The kid had been recording us for weeks, and apparently I'd said some things that sounded less than fatherly when played back in open court to a room full of strangers. Wade objected, of course, citing privacy concerns and procedural irregularities, but Judge Winters shut him down with a look that could have stopped traffic. The evidence stood. More recordings played. Me discussing liquidating the asset. Me referring to Preston as the autistic kid. Me calculating potential returns on investment, like he was a commodity instead of a human being. Each playback made me sound worse, like some kind of predatory vulture circling wounded prey. Context matters, of course, but context doesn't survive the editing process when someone's building a narrative. But the real gut punch came when Foster called Preston to testify. The kid stood up slowly, adjusted his portfolio with mechanical precision, and walked to the witness stand. No shuffling, no nervous. Fidgeting, no teenage awkwardness. He moved like someone who'd rehearsed this moment until every gesture was perfectly calculated. He spoke in that flat, emotionless tone I remembered, but his words were sharp as surgical instruments cutting through bone. "Mr. Bryce Reynolds left our family on October 15th, 2010, Preston began, consulting his notes. "I was 4 years and 7 months old. He has not contacted me once in 14 years, 2 months and 6 days. No birthday calls, no Christmas cards, no school event attendance. Zero financial support after December 2010. The kid had dates, exact dates, and documentation to back up every claim. However," Preston continued, "on March 12, 2024, exactly 8 days after my digital art sale was reported in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, Mr. Reynolds contacted attorney Wade Palmer to initiate legal proceedings regarding my assets. Judge Winters leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who just heard something significant. "Young man, how do you know these specific details?" Preston reached into his portfolio and pulled out a thick folder that looked like it belonged in a law office. "I maintain detailed records, Your Honor, financial statements, correspondence, public record searches. I began tracking Mr. Reynolds' activities when I turned 16 and gained access to legal databases through my high school's business law program." The kid had been planning this. For over a year, he'd been building a case file on me like some kind of junior private investigator, collecting evidence, documenting patterns, preparing for a confrontation he somehow knew was coming. Foster guided Preston through his testimony with surgical precision, like they'd rehearsed every question and answer until it flowed like a scripted performance. The kid explained how he'd set up a blockchain-based trust fund 3 months before his 18th birthday, with Colton Mills as trustee and an independent, saying, "Financial advisor managing distributions." "The smart contracts are immutable," Preston explained to the judge with the confidence of someone who understood technology better than most adults in that room. "They cannot be altered or dissolved without unanimous consent from all trustees, which includes representatives from 3 autism advocacy organizations. Smart contracts. Blockchain technology. The kid was using cryptocurrency programming to make his money legally untouchable. While I'd been building marketing campaigns for tech startups, he'd been learning to use their tools against me." Wade tried to punch holes in the testimony, arguing that a minor couldn't enter into such complex financial arrangements without proper adult supervision. But Preston had answers for everything. Yes, he understood the legal implications. Yes, he'd received independent counsel from a technology attorney specializing in digital assets. Yes, he was competent to make these decisions despite his autism diagnosis. Then the kid did something that stopped my heart. He looked directly at me for the first time since the hearing began. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, voice still flat, but eyes laser-focused with an intensity that cut through every excuse I'd been preparing. "You called me an investment opportunity in your recorded conversation with Mr. Palmer. You said, and I quote, 'Even if I get 50%, that's $400,000 clear profit for basically doing nothing.'" The courtroom went dead silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing to stare. "I am not an investment opportunity," Preston continued, each word delivered with mechanical precision. "I am not broken, I am not a burden, and I am not your son." That last part hit like a physical blow. Technically, legally, he was my son. But sitting there in that courtroom, looking at this teenager who had outmaneuvered me with the cold efficiency of a chess grandmaster, I realized something uncomfortable. He was absolutely nothing like me. Or maybe he was exactly like me, just better at it. Judge Winters didn't need long to deliberate. She had that look of someone who'd seen through every manipulation and recognized exactly what was happening in her courtroom. When she returned from her brief recess, the authority in her voice could have cut glass. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented today, this court finds the following." She adjusted her glasses and consulted her notes. "The trust arrangements established by Mr. Preston Reynolds are legally sound and were created with proper independent counsel. The request for guardianship by Mr. Bryce Reynolds is denied." The words hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. Denied. Completely. Furthermore, Judge Winters continued, "This court notes that abandonment is not erased by regret expressed after financial gain becomes apparent. Mr. Reynolds' 14-year absence from his stepson's life, followed immediately by legal action upon learning of the minor's financial success, demonstrates a pattern of behavior inconsistent with parental concern. That landed like a dropped weight. The judge was calling me a gold digger in legal language, and everyone in that courtroom understood exactly what she meant. The petition for guardianship is denied in full, and this court hereby issues a permanent injunction preventing future claims on Mr. Preston Reynolds' assets by the petitioner." For a moment, no one moved. Then sound rushed back into the room. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people processed what had just happened. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper. Evan exhaled just once, quietly. I realized he'd been holding his breath through the entire ruling. Wade gathered his papers with the mechanical movements of someone going through professional motions while internally calculating how to minimize the damage to his reputation. This case would follow him, and we both knew it. I turned toward Preston, searching for something: anger, satisfaction, even gloating. Instead, I found those same intense eyes studying me like I was a problem he'd finally solved. "You think you've won," I said, loud enough that my voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. Preston considered this for exactly 3 seconds, then spoke with the same flat precision he'd used throughout his testimony. "I know exactly what I've done," he said. "I made sure the truth stayed where everyone could see it." The simplicity of that statement was devastating. No drama, no theatrics, just absolute certainty that he'd outplayed me from the beginning. Outside the courthouse, local news crews swarmed like vultures sensing fresh meat. Some reporter with perfectly styled hair shoved a microphone in my face and asked how it felt to lose to a 17-year-old. How did it feel? It felt like getting schooled by someone I'd written off as defective 14 years ago. It felt like discovering that the damaged kid I'd abandoned had grown up to become a more effective strategist than I was. But I couldn't say any of that on camera. "We're evaluating our options," I managed, falling back on corporate speak that meant absolutely nothing. Wade tried to spin it as a procedural loss, something we could appeal on technical grounds, but I knew better. The kid had played this perfectly from the very first move. He'd recorded our conversations, documented my absence, secured his money in unbreakable digital contracts, and then sat back quietly while I walked directly into his trap. The drive back to Austin gave me 4 hours to think about what had just happened. Preston wasn't the damaged, helpless kid I'd left behind in 2010. He'd turned his obsessive attention to detail and pattern recognition into weapons. He'd used his supposed disability to lower everyone's expectations, then struck with calculated precision when the time was right. In a strange way, I was almost impressed. The kid had inherited something from me after all, just not what I'd expected. Strategic thinking, long-term planning, the ability to manipulate people's perceptions. He'd learned to weaponize sympathy the same way I'd learned to weaponize confidence. But here's the thing that really gets me. Everyone's painting this as some heartwarming story about a poor autistic kid overcoming adversity. The news articles, the social media posts, even that ridiculous GoFundMe someone started for autism awareness after our court case went viral on TikTok. They're missing the real story. Preston Reynolds isn't a victim. He's a predator who learned to use people's sympathy as camouflage. He manipulated that judge, played the media, and turned public opinion against me with the efficiency of a seasoned PR professional. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what I would have done. Ashley filed for divorce 2 weeks after the courthouse videos. Started trending across social media platforms. Bad optics for her consulting firm. She explained over dinner at the same restaurant where I'd proposed 3 years earlier. I couldn't really blame her. I'd built my career on understanding how narratives shape public perception. And this narrative painted me as the villain who abandoned a disabled child for money. The truth is more complicated, of course. It always is. But truth doesn't trend on social media, and it doesn't win custody battles or save marriages. I'm not some monster who hates disabled children. I'm a businessman who recognized an impossible situation and made a rational decision to cut my losses. Preston needed specialized care that I wasn't equipped to provide, and Brooke chose martyrdom over practicality. But 14 years later, that damaged kid used the same strategic thinking that built my company to destroy my reputation and protect his fortune. He played me like a cheap guitar, and I never saw it coming. So here's my advice, gentlemen. When you're evaluating potential investments, whether that's stocks, startups, or stepchildren, remember that sometimes the biggest returns come from the assets everybody else writes off. And sometimes those assets are playing a longer game than you could ever imagine. 3 months after the courthouse debacle, I was sitting in my downtown Austin office, staring at yet another news article about Preston's inspiring story of triumph over abandonment. The kid had donated $150,000 of his earnings to autism advocacy groups and another $100,000 to a scholarship fund for kids aging out of foster care. Strategic philanthropy that made him look even more sympathetic while generating positive press coverage. My business was surviving, barely. Losing a high-profile family court case and getting divorced in the same month had damaged my reputation in Austin's tight-knit tech community. Clients started asking uncomfortable questions about my character and family values. Funny how quickly success can turn into liability when the narrative shifts against you. I'd spent the last few months analyzing what went wrong, breaking down Preston's strategy like I was studying a competitor's successful campaign. The kid had identified his assets, legal standing, technological knowledge, moral high ground, and leveraged them perfectly. He'd anticipated my moves, documented my weaknesses, and positioned himself as the sympathetic underdog while making me look like a predatory opportunist, which, if I'm being honest, is exactly what I was. But here's what really gets me. Preston didn't just win. He made sure I lost completely. The trust fund, the media coverage, the legal injunction, it was all designed to ensure I could never come back for a second attempt. He'd thought 3 moves ahead while I was still trying to figure out the rules of the game. I found myself wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed in. 2010. If I'd been patient with his meltdowns, worked with his therapists, learned to communicate in his particular language, would he have used that same strategic intelligence to help build my company? Would we have been partners instead of adversaries? But that's sentimental thinking, and sentiment doesn't change the facts. I made a rational business decision based on the information available at the time, a 4-year-old with severe behavioral problems and no apparent potential for normal development. Any reasonable person would have made the same choice, except Colton Mills didn't. The welder saw something I missed, or maybe he just had lower expectations for return on investment. Either way, he'd spent 14 years raising someone else's kid and ended up with a loyal ally and a guaranteed financial future. Not a bad long-term strategy if you can stomach the daily grind. Preston Reynolds is worth $950,000 and climbing, with royalty payments that could reach hundreds of receipts, thousands more over the next decade. The kid who couldn't handle the wrong sandwich plate had learned to navigate cryptocurrency markets and intellectual property law. He'd turned his obsessive attention to detail into a marketable skill that generated wealth most people could only dream about. Me? I'm starting over at 42, rebuilding my reputation one client at a time. Ashley took half my assets in the divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and fundamental disagreements about family values. My attorney fees for the Preston case ran into 6 figures, and the negative publicity cost me at least that much in lost business. So, who's the real winner here? The question answers itself. I've had plenty of time to think about what this all means, and here's what I've concluded. Preston Reynolds represents something I never accounted for in my original calculations. I saw a disabled child and calculated the costs. Time, money, emotional energy, opportunity costs. I treated him like a liability on a balance sheet. What I failed to recognize was that his different way of processing the world wasn't just a limitation. It was also a competitive advantage. His obsessive attention to patterns, his ability to focus intensely on details, his talent for systematic thinking. In the right environment, with the right support, those traits became valuable assets. Colton Mills understood this instinctively. He didn't try to fix Preston or make him normal. He just provided stability and encouraged the kid's natural interests. When Preston started creating digital art, Mills didn't question whether it was a real career path. He bought better computer equipment and found online communities where Preston could learn advanced techniques. The result? A teenager who learned to monetize his unique perspective and protect himself legally before most kids his age could balance a checkbook. Meanwhile, I spent 14 years building a company based on helping other people tell their stories more effectively. I understood branding, narrative construction, public perception management, but I completely missed the story happening in my own home. Preston Reynolds taught me something I didn't expect to learn from someone I'd written off as developmentally disabled. The most dangerous opponents are the ones who let you underestimate them. He spent 14 years being dismissed as damaged goods, while quietly developing skills that would eventually make him wealthy and legally untouchable. I'd always prided myself on being able to read people, anticipate their moves, stay 2 steps ahead of the competition. But a 17-year-old kid with autism had outmaneuvered me so completely that I never saw it coming until it was far too late. That's not just a business lesson. It's a fundamental truth about human potential that I'd somehow forgotten in my pursuit of predictable returns and manageable risks. Sometimes the investments that seem most uncertain yield the greatest rewards, and sometimes the people you dismiss as liabilities end up teaching you the most important lessons about strategy, patience, and the long game. Preston Reynolds proved that the most successful revenge is the kind where your enemy defeats himself while you simply watch and document the process.